Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the lack of activity in the past few weeks. As you know, I've been really busy with the Susan Shore device project and, working out kind of all of the minor details and delegation, etc., etc. So that's been taking up quite a lot of my time, but thankfully I have it all organized in a smooth rhythm. Now, I will be mentioning some results that I have compiled so far from people who have completed the full 6 weeks of treatment. I will be mentioning some other details throughout the video as well. But the main topic of today's video is actually tinnitus, objective loudness versus distress. We're going to be talking about brain oscillations and different types of networks. It's a pretty interesting topic, so definitely stay tuned. And of course, I would like to thank my executive research partner, Lucy, for doing the research and compiling the materials that I used to make this video. I would also like to thank my current executive project assistant, Joanne, for very significantly helping with the data collection and all of the other details regarding the project. I would also like to thank Luca as well, and the FAQ team for organizing the materials necessary for the participants to read and learn about the device usage. Now, the first thing that we're going to be talking about is actually auditory cortex gamma. Now, researchers have, and I guess they still are, searching for an objective brain measure of tinnitus loudness with a particular focus on gamma band activity in the auditory cortex. Now, unfortunately, to date, findings have been rather inconsistent and very context dependent. Now, in the 2013 study by Tobias Balkenhol et al., 46 tinnitus patients, the resting EEG gamma power in auditory cortex correlated positively with tinnitus loudness only when loudness was measured by matching a reconstructed tinnitus sound, a complex mimic of the person's own tinnitus. And when loudness was measured by simpler tones at the tinnitus frequency or 1 kilohertz or other psychoacoustic metrics, no gamma correlation was found. So in other words, gamma power tracked loudness under a very specific matching method, which suggests gamma might reflect the brain's encoding of the tinnitus sound profile rather than loudness in general. Now, it's a narrow result that does not mean gamma universally encodes tinnitus volume. Now, in a follow-up study by Dirk de Ridder et al., the researchers distinguished subjectively perceived loudness, or how loud the tinnitus seems to the patient, from passively matched loudness, which is an external sound matched in loudness to the tinnitus. And they found no brain correlate for the passively matched loudness, but the subjective loudness was associated with the increased high beta gamma activity in the auditory cortex and even gamma in the parahippocampal region. Now, really interestingly, these gamma oscillations in the auditory and memory-related areas interacted via the theta-gamma coupling, which suggests an attention or salience component. Now, the implication is that auditory cortex gamma correlates with the perceived prominence of tinnitus, or how attention-grabbing or loud it feels, but not with an externally matched loudness when the perception isn't actively engaged. So basically, gamma's link to loudness shows up in subjective, attention-driven context, not as purely objective sound intensity. Now, in another 2012 experiment by William Sedley et al., they leveraged a brief sound exposure to change tinnitus loudness, also known as residual inhibition, which revealed conflicting gamma behaviors. Now, when the residual inhibition noise temporarily suppressed tinnitus, auditory cortex gamma actively decreased along with tinnitus loudness, consistent with gamma power tracking intensity. But in some cases, the sound had the opposite effect. So tinnitus briefly worsened, which is known also as residual excitation. And interestingly enough, the gamma also decreased, even as the tinnitus loudness increased. And in these people, the louder tinnitus came with lower gamma power, which is the exact opposite relationship, because the gamma loudness link flipped depending on the context. And the researchers concluded in the paper that gamma oscillations cannot serve as a simple tinnitus volume dial. The role of gamma is definitely more complex and possibly involved with regulatory or inhibitory processes rather than directly encoding the perceived volume. And at the group level, people with more debilitating tinnitus don't show universally elevated gamma. In fact, the opposite was reported, and tinnitus sufferers classified as highly bothered had lower power in theta, beta, and gamma bands compared to controls, whereas those with mild tinnitus showed no significant difference from non-tinnitus controls. This pattern strongly aligns with tinnitus distress levels rather than loudness per se. The most distressed patients had less overall cortical oscillatory power in several bands, possibly reflecting a state of inhibitory exhaustion or altered network function. And such results underscore that tinnitus loudness doesn't map in any straightforward way onto a single brainwave like gamma. It also shows how, for example, something like anxiety can introduce bias into different studies that use brainwaves as their main metric, for example. So yeah, basically brain activity can diverge depending on individual factors like attention and distress. Now, to demonstrate the lack of correlation between tinnitus distress and objective tinnitus volume, up here on the screen I have the data that I managed to scrape together from 10 users who finished the full 6 weeks of treatment. Now, you can see that the TFI is the solid lines, displayed as the solid lines, and the THI are the dotted lines, and they move in parallel. Now, of course, it's obvious that several users demonstrate consistent downward trends, which suggests improvement in tinnitus burden or subjective suffering, for example. Of course, there's other fluctuations or just stability in general. Now, the variability across the participants is notable, with some other reductions approaching close to 40 points. Now, while these patterns do suggest individual improvements, the dataset is still too small and heterogeneous to draw any conclusions about group-level statistical significance without any formal repeated measures or testing. So while this graph can help visualize the general trend of tinnitus distress, it does not show formal statistic or does not prove statistical significance. I'm going to be going through each of these users' objective improvements or objective changes as well. So you can just watch the graph while I walk through them. Okay, let's start with user 1. Now, user 1 is quite an interesting case. Case of severe reactivity combined with severe, of course, tinnitus and hyperacusis as well. and also severe depression and anxiety. Another thing that should be mentioned about the dark blue user 1 is that they were on a steady dose of clonazepam for, I believe, 3 months before the treatment started, and they tapered from 1.5 milligrams, I believe, down to 1 milligrams throughout the course of the entire treatment period. Now, despite the fact of this user's TFI and THI metrics actually worsening over the course of the treatment period, their baseline tinnitus actually decreased. And they wake up, from their words, they wake up most mornings with nearly zero tinnitus. However, their sound sensitivity to high frequencies is severe, which I assume is hyperacusis. But the baseline tinnitus after, hearing loud sounds does not increase much. So it starts, after the entire treatment period, the baseline starts like at a 0 to 1 at the start of the day, and it ends in maybe like a 3 to 4 by the end of the day. Now, on the other hand, the hyperacusis, and I assume the reactivity, I didn't really get exactly what they meant by reactivity. I assume they meant either the reactivity to high-frequency sounds or maybe the loudness hyperacusis triggering to high-frequency sounds. Actually did not change throughout the treatment period. Only the baseline tinnitus that was actually targeted by the device decreased in any manner whatsoever. So they're going to continue the treatment after this. We're going to switch it up a little bit. Whether or not this was due to the decrease of clonazepam leading to tolerance, whether this was, the lack of their usual sound enrichment for their hyperacusis, I don't know. But generally speaking, the objective tinnitus metrics of the tinnitus baseline were positive for this user, so there was a positive change. Now, regarding the hyperacusis, I guess we'll see how that goes later on. So we're adjusting the treatment and we're going to keep going. Now, user 2 is also an interesting case. Now, they are actually one of my oldest participants. They were one of the first people to receive actually the old version of the device as well, which was like last year. Now, interestingly enough, the old device, which, lacked any, special features like constant current control and, different various upgrades for sound quality and accuracy, they actually improved from it. This is not shown on the graph, but they improved from it in an interesting way. About half of their weeks, they experienced no constant tinnitus. So it was basically pretty much silence all day, with just, random zings and zaps occasionally. And this actually happened practically, just practically never happened before their tinnitus. I think they mentioned only at the beginning, it was near onset, that this would actually happen. But after the first device usage, the old version of the device usage, they were experiencing about 3 days a week of this no constant tinnitus. And they explained, in their words, that on these no tinnitus days, their anxiety and stress was just gone. It was just not there. And this actually is, an example of a person with a strong, correlation of TFI and THI regarding their objective tinnitus improvement. And after they finished the device, from what I remember, these results persisted, but eventually started falling out, but still persisted to an extent. Now, after a break, they received the upgraded version of the device, which is the one that I've described most recently on my channel. And after 6 weeks of using this version of the device, the positive effects actually returned, meaning that they experience, entire days with pretty much no tinnitus whatsoever. Now, except now, it was actually even more. It was not just 3 days, it was 4 to 5 days occasionally, so practically the entire week with no constant tinnitus. Now, you're probably wondering, if this is the case, then why the hell does his TFI and THA not change at all? Well, as they explained to me, they took the questionnaire exclusively on the days where they still had the constant tinnitus, not on the silent days. So because they took the questionnaire on the constant tinnitus days, their TFI and THI remained unchanged, whereas in his own words, on the total lack of tinnitus days that he had, which were actually the majority of the week at this point, they saw, like, as they described, they had like a total lack of any anxiety or stress whatsoever, just complete elevated positive mindset. And so about this, another fact about this user is that they actually spiked due to an external event, which was, I think, something like a fire truck passing their car, and they weren't wearing protection. No judgment, shit happens. So they actually had a spike, and the continuous tinnitus returned. And they stopped using the device to kind of, allow it to settle a little bit. And so, but actually, cool fact is that after a week, these no tinnitus days actually returned. So, regardless of the fact that they spiked, their tinnitus actually decreased, back to the baseline, and these no continuous tinnitus days that were from the device usage actually returned. It would have, of course, been nice to have some metrics for the no tinnitus days. However, from their own words, it can be understood that since their anxiety and stress was practically at a zero on the no continuous tinnitus days, then we can probably assume that their TFI and THI is also quite minimal on these days as well. Now, before we continue, I would like to mention that the people who saw the most significant objective improvements were actually the people who followed the protocol to a T. Basically, they read all the documentation, all of the guides attentively. They verified electrode placement. They verified sound, the sound that was generated for them. And generally, it was actually a pleasure working with a lot of these participants, with most of these participants up on the graph. Unfortunately, that's not the case for everybody. Many people are unfortunately dismissive about the questionnaires, either not filling them in at all or just disappearing for weeks on end. Now, putting this all together was a massive pain, unfortunately. It was took way more time than I actually expected it to. So huge thank you to everybody who complied to the project's regulations and protocol. Now, another important thing that I actually forgot to mention is that less than half of the people up on this graph actually were confident or fully confident in the tonality or the frequency of their tinnitus. By tonality, I mean like pure, closer to a pure tone, like an E, or closer to like a hiss, like a S or a sh, something like that. Unfortunately, finding tinnitus frequency for a lot of people is actually really difficult, especially, with these multitudes of factors. A lot of people are, spend weeks on trial and error. Personally, for me, it was quite easy to pinpoint it, for me specifically, and actually for user 1 and user 2 as well, because for all of us, our somatosensory modulation frequency, which is the frequency which appears during a somatosensory modulation, was actually the same frequency as the baseline. So in those cases, it's actually really easy to pinpoint it, especially if a person has, multiple tones in their tinnitus, because during the modulation, the baseline just increases in volume, and the baseline is actually what needs to be targeted during the treatment. So, it's not going to be really easy for everybody to find it, unfortunately. And even though the software available at this point is quite extensive and easy to use, some people still find difficulty in pinpointing their frequency and tonality. Now, about user 3, nothing can really be said about their case. Very typical tinnitus case. Just, moderate tinnitus that can be heard outside. For example, moderate to severe anxiety. And as you can see from the graph, there's a general, kind of pretty strong downward trend of the TFI and THI. Now, they didn't actually fill out the THI for week 6. I only have the data for TFI. I don't know why, but I'm not going to ask them to redo it, so that's just how it is. I can probably assume that since there's a strong correlation between both of them, then the downward trend of the THI is probably similar to the TFI in week 6. Really smooth, actually, progression here. Their tinnitus volume also decreased objectively quite similarly to the decrease in their TFI and THI metrics. So their tinnitus went from being able to hear outside and pretty much everywhere to hear periodically inside in a moderately silent environment. And the ability of their masking, like, for example, masked by a shower and masked by a sink, for example, also increased actually significantly. Very also strongly correlated with their THI and TFI metrics. So in typical cases with not a lot of cofactors like this particular user, there is actually a strong correlation between TFI and THI and objective tinnitus improvement. Now let's move on to user 4, is the red line. Now, as you can see from the graph, there was pretty much not a very significant change in their TFI and THI metrics. And you can actually see that the TFI pretty much ended up at the exact same spot where it was in the beginning. Now, this case is quite interesting as well. This is also a person who suffers from pretty significant anxiety. And from what they said, around between the 2nd and the 5th week, there was some significant family event or something like that apparently spiked their anxiety or their worry, I suppose. I'm not quite sure what the reason for the spike between week 5 and week 6 was. I did not clarify with that. But around week 5, they explained to me that they had a significant reduction in ear pain from noise, a reduction in facial pain as well, also from noise. The tinnitus baseline did not change very significantly. From their words, their tonality changed. So it kind of morphed from multiple tones into kind of like a more unified hiss. The volume did not change very significantly from their words. Their metrics show that there was only a 1-point change in the baseline regarding the minimum masking level metrics. However, I would say that the information that they shared regarding their pain from noise was actually quite significant as well. But so in generally, the objective improvement trend for this user was also pretty significant, whereas the subjective metrics, meaning the TFI and THI, actually did not correlate very well with their objective improvements. I would also like to add that this specific user, user 4, was not very confident about their tinnitus frequency during their frequency testing, no matter how much we tried to pinpoint it exactly. Now, user 5, who, as you can see, is the purple line, is actually also quite a typical case. So, very, very heightened anxiety, and also moderate, I would say, objective tinnitus severity. So, from their words, they did not hear their tinnitus outside. basically. They just did not hear it outside, and they could hear it in a quiet room. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that this person is mild. However, I would say that the stress and suffering, or the reaction to their tinnitus was actually quite significant. Now, if we talk about their objective changes, they went from barely being able to hear it outside to not being able to hear it outside anymore, pretty much at all. And considering this user spent a significant time, a significant percentage of their day outside, since they have an outside, I guess, job, I suppose that not being able to hear their tinnitus outside anymore had a very significant effect on their, stress and anxiety metrics. Now, regarding the overall objective improvements, I would say that objectively speaking, it was very hard to pinpoint whether or not this user had a very significant change, since the shower and the sink, I guess, masking metrics were pretty much identical. The only thing that really changed was they, went from barely being able to hear it outside to barely being able to hear it inside. So again, this time around, I guess you could say that this is also a strong correlation of TFI and THI reduction to objective tinnitus improvement as well. Now, the next user being user 6, or the brown points, the brown lines on the graph. This user was very strange because there was pretty much absolutely no correlation to their TFI and THI metrics and their objective improvements. I honestly have no idea what was going on in this user's head throughout the treatment period. But from what their words described, and regarding also their objective metrics that were recorded, there was actually a very, very significant downwards trend of their objective tinnitus volume. So they went from being able to hear it clearly outside, absolutely everywhere, to only being able to hear it in quiet rooms. They went also from a shift in tonality, so kind of something similar to happen to me, that multiple tones morphed into one steady tone, which is also easier to handle, actually. And they also actually had a loudness discomfort level improvement as well, so their hyperacusis also improved. And this user actually also showed an improvement in their oral fullness, and their TTTS or MEM, which is basically ear thumping. This is actually another interesting case. We barely actually had these in before, so it's good to have another data point regarding MEM or TTTS. So I don't really understand why this user's TFI and THI spiked so significantly, despite the fact that they had amazing objective improvements. One thing that I could probably say is the reason behind, for example, that final dip in TFI and THI at the end, was we had a discussion regarding their objective improvements, and this participant was one of those people, I guess, who, kind of have an all or nothing approach. So despite the fact of their very significant objective improvements, the fact that they didn't have, complete and total silence, for example, in a quiet room, I guess, distraught them, I suppose. So again, this is also an example of how the type of person who is, participating or using the device or their expectations can also actually very significantly affect the TFI and THI metrics, regardless of their objective improvements. Now, regarding user 7, you know who you are. I gotta say that it was an absolute pleasure working with this particular person because they knew exactly what they had to do. They've been watching my videos for a very long time. They were very invested in the treatment. They did absolutely everything correctly. They pinpointed their frequency exactly, their somatosensory baseline frequency exactly. So this is a very good example of, the perfect participant. And of course, the results that they got indicated this as well. So again, this is not a particularly catastrophic case, but nevertheless, this person was homebound to an extent, only leaving to walk in the park, for example, when there's no people around. And as you can see, there is a very, very significant dip, both in their THI and TFI, which correlated very well with each other as well. And this improvement in their THI and TFI matrix also very, very significantly correlated with their objective improvements. So I got to just say congratulations to this person for achieving exactly what they wanted to with the treatment. And, putting in the work and effort into reading all the documentation and into matching your frequency. So an excellent job by this person. And I'm really glad that they were able to recover their quality of life so significantly. Now, regarding user 8, this is a pretty strange person. They did not speak English very well, so communication with them was really hard. I don't really know what exactly to say about them, despite the fact that they had a very massive spike in TFI and THI actually from week 5 to week 6. I suppose this could be because they did not see that much of a significant objective change in their tinnitus. Regarding this user's frequency, they swapped between 4 kilohertz to 8 kilohertz to 10 kilohertz when we were setting up their audio. So I don't really know how accurate their tinnitus targeting or their tinnitus frequency targeting actually was. I don't really know much about their case either because they were not communicative with me at all. So there's not much I can say about this guy other than the fact that unfortunately did not see that much objective improvement. And closer to the end, you can also see that their anxiety spiked very significantly. So strong correlation between their TFI and THI metrics, especially closer to the end there. I'm going to try working with them in the future to maybe make some adjustments and, try to find the frequency again. But unfortunately, it was very tough working with this particular individual, and there's not much I can say about their results. They were not positive, they were not negative. So I guess you might as well call this person a non-responder for now, until we can figure out a better way to target their tinnitus frequency, which they were very unsure of. Now, regarding user 9, this was actually also a very, pleasant user to work with. Very similar to user 7 in the case that they listened to me, they did what they were told, they read all the documentation, they made significant lifestyle adjustments. So this user's TFI and THI dipped actually quite significantly, very strong dip in THI, as you can see, especially from week 5 to week 6. And this was actually the place where they saw the most objective improvements in their tinnitus volume. So this was, again, similar to, I believe, user 1. Their baseline decreased very significantly. Total silence in the mornings, slowly kind of going up throughout the day with sound exposure. But if they're in a silent environment, their tinnitus stayed absolutely the same. Their hyperacusis, which was actually moderate, also decreased significantly, and they told me that they started going outside and going to parks and stuff like that. However, I of course told them that it's not a good idea to do that, especially while the treatment is still ongoing. But regardless of that, the objective improvements were significant, and they correlated also quite well with the TFI and THI metrics. So they went from hearing it loudly and clearly outside to hearing it in a moderately not noisy, but a moderately noisy environment inside. And they went from hearing it in the shower, and while the sink was turned on, to not hearing it in the shower at all, and while the sink was turned on at all. So again, very, very high correlation of THI and TFI to objective tinnitus improvement, and this person was generally satisfied with the results, which can of course explain why their TFI and THI dipped so significantly there at the end. Now, regarding user 10, this person actually did see some spiking from week 1 to week 2. Unknown if it was actually correlated to device usage, if the volume was too loud, for example, or external factors, because a whole bunch happened in the second week. A whole bunch of stuff happened in their life, and some noise exposure as well. However, in week 3, they saw some significant objective improvements with a 2-point reduction in a 10-point scale regarding objective severity. Now, in week 4, between week 3 and week 4, they spiked again. This time, absolutely, 100% due to external factors. It was some sort of loud noise that occurred outside, so their tinnitus spiked up, actually even higher than it was in the second week spike. But then it actually faded, I would say, and from week 4 to week 6, they saw some further objective improvements. Now, while the net change was actually not very significant, and the THI actually ended up being worse than it was in the first week, their overall baseline improvement did decrease a net of 1 point. Now, I don't know how much it would have decreased if they didn't spike twice in the treatment period, but they, of course, are going to continue using the device, and we'll see how they continue improving, if at all. Now, if we're talking about complete and total non-responders and people who have spiked, unfortunately or fortunately, there was only one user who very obviously spiked from the device usage. They have a very catastrophic, very catastrophic level objectively of tinnitus, and unfortunately, even the minimal audio was too much for them, and they had a spike, so they had to stop the treatment. Regarding everybody else who was not included in the graph, the previous graph, these people either did not complete the treatment yet, or they stopped halfway through due to external factors like, for example, spiking, due to like a loud neighbor or some significant noise event that occurred outside, and their data was unfortunately incomplete. It's a shame because there was actually a lot of very, very good results that these people were having before they spiked. For example, very significant decrease in facial pain. There was also a decrease in burning ear pain in another user, which unfortunately spiked back up after an external incident. And regarding non-responders, overall, there were, I believe, 4 non-responders, complete and total non-responders so far, who are continuing using the device. Now, why specifically these people are not responding to the treatment whatsoever is honestly a mystery to me. I can say with confidence that 3 out of the 4 people were extremely uncertain about their tinnitus frequency. And unless a person is certain about their tinnitus frequency, we can't really say exactly why the treatment worked for them and why the treatment didn't work for them. It could just be that their brains were less plastic, for example. It could be just, the treatment just was ineffective for them. They needed to use it longer. We don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to work out. Considering the huge amount of hours that I invested in this project so far, I'm actually going to be slowing down the obsessive data collection for now, because the amount of current participants who are going to receive a device is actually quite expansive at the moment, and it's becoming more and more difficult for me, and even for my assistant, who's pretty much working full-time on this, 12 hours a day, to consult and to collect all of this data. So we're going to see how it goes in the future, but the amount of participants that unfortunately do not comply to protocol, do not read the documentation, they invest absolutely zero time into preparation for the treatment is staggeringly high. I did not expect it to be so much.
But the people are retarded.
Working with people like this is a really, really massive pain in the ass. I would just be blunt and say it. So I guess we'll see how it goes, but I'm going to be a little bit more, I guess you could say, lenient towards data collection in the future, and probably only track simple metrics, like, for example, whether or not somebody improved objectively speaking or not, or whether or not they haven't responded or not responded to the treatment. We'll basically see how it goes. So far, if we include everybody who's currently using the device, even the people who haven't been using it for 6 weeks yet, as I might have mentioned before in the channel in my Discord server, the percentage of people who are seeing positive effects compared to the percentage of people who are seeing no benefit, it's about a 70 to 30% ratio. And we're not exactly sure why some of the people are not responding, because a lot of the non-responders, as I mentioned before, they are uncertain about their tinnitus frequency. They're uncertain about a lot of different things. And there's been actually a massive correlation of efficacy of the device to how certain and how well-informed a person is about the treatment in general. So can't draw any conclusions just yet. We'll just see how it goes. Now, moving on with video. Some modern neuroscience framework suggests that chronic tinnitus isn't just like an aberrant, ringing in the ear. It's the result of dysregulation across multiple large-scale brain networks responsible for how we process sound, focus attention, and assign emotional meaning. In particular, a triple network model has been proposed by de Ridder, which draws parallels to other brain disorders involving perception and mood, like chronic pain or depression. Now, regarding these pathways, the first one would be the lateral or the sound pathway or the auditory network. And this includes the classical auditory system from the ear up through the auditory brainstem and the cortex, which, according to Susan Short's model, the brainstem is vastly significant in tinnitus generation, and the cortex is also possibly involved in the maladaptive feedback loops due to excitatory and inhibitory balance or other triggers. The auditory circuits start producing the tinnitus signal. However, apparently, due to this model by itself, the aberrant sensory activity may not be enough for conscious tinnitus. And the other pathway is the medial or the suffering pathway, which is also known as the limbic or the salience network. And this is the brain's emotional salience circuitry, which involves regions like the anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DAC, and this is also a part of the salience network, as well as the amygdala and the hippocampus. And these areas determine if a stimulus is important or upsetting. And in tinnitus, the salience network is, for some people, it hyper-assigns significance to the internally generated sound. And this phantom noise is flagged as emotionally relevant and alarming. And the medial pathway underlies the anxiety, frustration, and distress, the suffering component of tinnitus. Now, I don't particularly think that suffering is exactly the same as anxiety. I think that they are different pathways. This is just basing it off my own case, because I had a total lack of anxiety, however, overwhelming suffering from my tinnitus reactivity and stuff like that. But we're just going to move along with this researched model for now. Now, the suffering component of tinnitus and distress correlates with activity in the limbic regions, of course, like the right insula and the orbital frontal cortex, not with primary auditory cortex activity. And this network interaction explains why two people can have the same tinnitus loudness, but vastly different reactions. One is unbothered, while the other is distressed. Their salience or limbic circuits are driving the difference. Now, the descending or noise-canceling pathway, the central executive or controlled networks. Now, regarding this, the brain isn't a passive receiver of sensory inputs. It actively filters and suppresses relevant information. And the central executive network, including the prefrontal cortex, like the dorsolateral PFC, and parietal focus areas, normally work to keep us on task and regulate attention. A connected noise cancellation system involving the prefrontal cortex, thalamus, and striatum is hypothesized to suppress tinnitus signals before they reach consciousness. In a healthy brain, this gating system, sometimes termed as the frontal striatal gating loop, can tune out the tinnitus like ignoring background noise. And in chronic tinnitus, that inhibitory system is underpowered or impaired, apparently, and this phantom sound is not gated out. And the result is that the CEN cannot effectively divert attention away. Instead, the intrusive sound continuously monopolizes cognitive resources. And this is why many tinnitus sufferers report concentration and memory problems. And over time, the ongoing internal noise and the emotional stress can, of course, further disrupt executive function, which creates a vicious cycle. And these three pathways correlate to the three core brain networks identified in the triple network model of psychopathology, actually. The default mode network, the salience network, and the central executive network. And the DMN, the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, etc., is our inward-focused, self-referential network. The SN, or the insular cortex, and the DAC, as I mentioned before, flags important stimuli and switches brain states. The CEN, the DLPFC, parietal cortex, handles the goal-directed attention and task execution. And in tinnitus, the salience network is overactive for some individuals. The tinnitus is incessantly flagged as a salient negative stimulus, provoking distress and keeping the individual's brain glued to the sound. And the default mode network can become abnormally coupled to the tinnitus, integrating the phantom sound into the brain's resting state self-activity. And tinnitus can essentially become embedded as part of the default brain chatter, and this may be an energy-saving adaptation, as one paper suggested. The brain, unable to cancel the noise, starts treating it like a normal part of the environment to reduce the constant alerting. Unfortunately, that can also make the tinnitus feel present and personal and harder to ignore. And the central executive network is then hampered. The intrusive, phantom sound and emotional turmoil consume bandwidth that would otherwise be used for concentration and executive function. Of course, some tinnitus patients often struggle with attention, and this network imbalance explains why. Now, physiological evidence backs this model as well. Now, brain imaging studies show that the degree of tinnitus distress or severity correlates not with the auditory cortex activity, but with functional connectivity between the salience network and the default mode and limbic network. And patients with more severe tinnitus have stronger aberrant coupling between these regions. Essentially, the brain's emotion focus circuitry is tightly locked onto the tinnitus. Conversely, people who habituate to tinnitus or who have less distress show more engagement of the frontal or the suppressor circuits that likely correspond to the noise-canceling pathways. And in one EEG study of sudden hearing loss patients, those who did not develop tinnitus showed higher information flow in what the authors called the tinnitus suppressing networks, including auditory and frontal regions, effectively overriding the triple network activation. Meanwhile, those with tinnitus had hyperactivation of the DMN, SN, and CEN, the triple network engaged in a maladaptive way. And importantly, treatments targeting the brain's reaction to tinnitus have documented changes in these networks, even when the tinnitus sound itself remains. For example, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which trains patients to non-judgmentally acknowledge tinnitus and reduce stress, led to significant decrease in functional connectivity between the DMN, the salience network, and the amygdala over an 8-week course. And patients reported improvements in tinnitus, distress, and quality of life. And their brain scans reflected a calming of the hyperconnections among the self-referential and salience circuits. And very, very importantly, the tinnitus loudness did not change. Only the distress did. And this finding reinforces that the networks were carrying the burden of suffering rather than the sound itself. And similarly, conventional cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most evidence-based talk therapy for tinnitus distress, reliably reduces tinnitus-related anxiety, depression, and intrusiveness as measured by questionnaires, etc., etc. Yet, patients' audiological loudness matches often remain the same before and after therapy. Meta-analysis have confirmed that CBT helps people cope better with tinnitus, lessening the perceived loudness and annoyance in daily life, even though it doesn't typically lower the actual phantom sound intensity. In neural terms, CBT likely strengthens frontal executive control and reappraises the tinnitus signal, downweighting its salience despite the auditory system still generating the noise in exactly the same manner. Now, another brain signature of tinnitus distress is abnormal cross-frequency coupling, which is a hallmark of the so-called thalamocortical dysrhythmia. This refers to low-frequency brain waves like theta rhythms, 4 to 8 hertz, becoming coupled or nested with higher frequency gamma oscillations. In tinnitus sufferers with high distress, studies have found excessive theta-gamma interactions between the anterior cingulate, part of the salience network, and auditory cortex. And this coupling is thought to reflect the ongoing engagement of the suffering network with the auditory phantom experience, which, tinnitus, basically. And fascinatingly, such pathological cross-frequency coupling diminishes when patients experience relief from tinnitus distress. And after effective therapies like CBT, mindfulness, or whatever, reductions in theta-gamma coupling and in aberrant delta or theta power have been discovered or observed alongside clinical improvement. It's as if the brain's networks uncouple from the tinnitus or the phantom frequency when the person stops suffering from it. And all these lines of evidence point to a consistent story. The intensity of tinnitus is not coded in a single auditory center, but the suffering it causes is deeply embedded in the brain-wide network dynamics. And the triple network model provides a unifying framework that tinnitus arises from an imbalance where the lateral sound pathway's activity is unchecked due to a malfunction in the descending inhibitory network, and the medial suffering pathway goes into overdrive. But unfortunately, a lot of people kind of twist these results, and they state that, for example, subjective tinnitus volume, as they call it, is the same as objective tinnitus volume, which is absolutely ridiculous, because subjective loudness or tinnitus loudness is literally just how focused somebody is on their tinnitus. And a lot of people are using this or twisting these words to try and say that objective tinnitus volume is exactly the same as how focused a person is on their tinnitus. And that's, absolutely not correct. I mean, as much as we know, thalamocortical dysrhythmia in the field of tinnitus could be complete bullshit. For example, in one study, they found that the tinnitus on-off switch involves increased theta in the pregenual anterior cingulate cortex, but is associated with decreased theta of functional connectivity between the pregenual anterior cingulate cortex and the auditory cortex, resulting in increased theta gamma cross-frequency coupling linked to loudness perception. In this kind of quote here from the paper, they do not mention if they're talking about distress or objective loudness. They just say it's an on-off switch, which is a vast misinterpretation, or I would even say a piece of misinformation that has led some people astray to believe that these things are the same thing, when that's obviously not true. The ACC cannot objectively silence tinnitus by not letting it reach conscious perception by increasing its alpha activity. So you cannot just get rid of tinnitus by getting rid of distress. That's not how it works, and that's not what the science shows. Now, if we return to the topic of the thalamus, research by Rauschecker and his colleagues states that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens, which are key limbic regions, put a brake on the auditory thalamus, preventing phantom sounds from intruding into consciousness. And they propose, or they suggest, the gate is broken in people with chronic tinnitus. However, the evidence indicates that thalamic gating failure is not uniform in all tinnitus patients. It's most likely present only in a subset of cases under certain conditions. For example, the thalamocortical dysrhythmia pattern, characterized by the abnormal low-frequency theta activity in auditory circuits coupled with high-frequency oscillations, which is a sign of the thalamus and cortex trying but failing to suppress a signal, is detected in some EEG or MEG studies, but not all of them. And in the residual inhibition study that we discussed earlier, only about half the patients show the textbook theta-gamma correlation when their tinnitus loudness changed. And in the residual excitation cases, the expected TCD pattern inverted. The tinnitus grew, but the cortical gamma fell, which cannot be explained by existing models of thalamic gating alone. And this suggests that while thalamic gating is a real phenomenon, it isn't the sole mechanism for tinnitus in every individual. Some people's tinnitus might arise just from a very severe degree of hypersynchrony, which is recognized by the brain as a significant auditory event, even if their thalamic gate is mostly working. Now, interestingly enough, many reports of pronounced thalamocortical rhythm changes come from extreme cases or those involving specific pharmacological states. For example, in studies where tinnitus patients underwent anesthesia or took certain drugs, researchers more clearly observed the bursting thalamic activity and strong theta-gamma coupling consistent with TCD. It appears that only when neural hypersynchrony becomes severe does it overcome the functional gate. In other words, a minor phantom signal might be successfully vetoed by the thalamus, so the person isn't consciously aware of it. But if the auditory system's aberrant firing grows strong enough, the signal pushes through into awareness, like into conscious awareness, or processed in the cortex. So the gate can either be weakened from some top-down sort of processes, or it can be so strong that it overcomes its natural function. So it's important to not mix these two groups together or assume that there is a failure in thalamic gating function in every single tinnitus sufferer. That's basically everything I wanted to say today. I'd like again to thank absolutely everybody involved in helping bring this project to light. It's been an absolutely crazy several months. A lot of work invested, and I wouldn't have been able to do it myself. And of course, I would like to thank Susan Shore for her excellent research and for making this whole thing possible, and to members of the community as well. And if you have any questions regarding your case, tinnitus, hyperacusis, noxiacusis, anything, feel free, of course, to join my Discord server, linked in the description, my channel, or in the pinned comment. And of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you later.